Chapter 20. The Russian Connection. Was Russia somehow involved in the plot against Austria's future leader? In government circles, people asked that question at the time, and in scholarly circles, academics have asked that question ever since. Russian involvement would have made little sense. Franz Ferdinand was the leading pro-Russian in his government, therefore removing him from the scene would have run counter to Russia's interests. Of course his political views were misunderstood elsewhere, so perhaps they were in St. Petersburg as well. Perhaps the extent of his friendship was not fully understood. But as a champion of monarchism throughout Europe, surely, on fiercely held principle, the Tsar would have opposed such a murder. Russia's Balkan policy, run in the field by Nikolai Hartwig as minister to Serbia, 1909-14, was, as noted earlier, susceptible to being viewed as in the nature of a rogue operation. A militant pan-Slav, with long service in and knowledge of the Balkans and the Middle East, Hartwig used the Serb cause as a weapon in his struggle against his own government, according to the well-informed French minister in Belgrade. With the support of conservative and orthodox circles at St. Petersburg he battled Sazonov, the foreign minister, and he dragged Russian diplomacy toward the Balkan evolution of the last 2 years, which he had the merit of conceiving and carrying out. It was Hartwig who had brought the Balkan states together for a time against both Turkey and Austria, and it was generally believed that he dictated policy in Belgrade. But he was unlikely to have approved the Black Hand plot. He had just rescued the Pasich government from Apis, approving the more cautious non-provocative faction against the hotheads. It apparently is true that the Russian military attaché in Belgrade, Colonel Viktor Artamanov, worked closely with Apis. The two may have run spy networks together. According to some allegations, at one time Artamanov provided Apis with funds for operations. It is not inconceivable that in some fashion Artamanov became aware that Apis was helping the Bosnian schoolboys. There is a story that Artamanov may also have assured Apis that he had it on good authority that if Austria attacked, Russia would come to Serbia's aid. There is no evidence, however, that anyone in a position to give such a guarantee on behalf of the Tsar's government did so. George Malcolm Thompson, a popular historian, writes in the 12 Days, 1964, that Artamanov was, from an early stage, a party to the Black Hand conspiracy to murder the Archduke. Thompson bases his claim on the research of Albertini, research that does not support such an unqualified allegation. Artamanov denied everything in an interview with Albertini. Albertini did not believe Artamanov's story, but could not disprove it. A document dated June 12, 1914, found in recently opened Russian Ministry of Defense files, relates that in 1910 Russia extended a subsidy of 4 million francs to the Serbian Army's officer corps and that the money had been misused and disappeared long since. The document, which originated from the Russian military agent in Serbia, hinted that some of the money might have been improperly siphoned off to the Black Hand, and it appears to confirm that the Russian government, based upon this past experience, would not consider providing any more funds to the Serbian officer corps. The assumption is that Russia would not want to help the Black Hand. Was there a Russian connection in the Sarajevo affair? If there was, no evidence of it has yet been uncovered. A few days before the assassination, Prime Minister Pasich received an anonymous letter. Its author speculated that the Austrian government might arrange to have that foolish Ferdinand killed during the Bosnian maneuvers, and then blame it on Pasich's government as an excuse to start a war against Serbia. It is not what happened, but it could have been. Chapter 21. The Terrorists Strike. Sunday, June 28, 1914. Early in the morning, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his consort, Sophie, prayed at Mass in a chapel set up for them at their hotel. Leaving the suburban spa of Elise, they then boarded a train to Sarajevo, a trip of less than half an hour. At the railroad terminal on the outskirts of town, they transferred to automobiles, in which they rode the rest of the way. The display of motor vehicles was striking. Only recently had the automobile come into common use. The procession of chauffeur-driven cars entered Sarajevo somewhere between 9:30 and 10 a.m., heading for the town hall. The mayor and the chief of police led the way in the first auto. The Archduke and the Duchess followed in the second, a convertible touring car that had been borrowed for their use. With them was the military governor, General Potiorek. The owner of the borrowed car, Count Franz von Harrach, sat in front next to the driver. The rest of the procession, between 2 and 4 other vehicles, depending upon whose account one accepts, followed. The rains had finally stopped. The morning mists disappeared. A dazzling sunshine beamed down upon the anniversary couple, he, brilliantly attired in his many-colored uniform, she, radiant in white. At last, side by side at a formal official celebration, they took in the sights and sounds along the route, and the enthusiasm of the cheering crowds and the booming of the 24 cannon salutes. Later, historians were puzzled by the lack of security precautions. Soldiers ought to have lined the route but did not. Some 22,000 Habsburg troops were in the vicinity, but General Potiorek detailed only an honor guard of 120 to escort and protect Franz Ferdinand and his party. It was explained later that the general wanted to prove that under his iron-fisted rule, order was so firmly established that policing was unnecessary. If so, what Potiorek proved was the reverse of what he had intended. Turbulent Bosnia was a borderland. It and its neighbors formed the arena where East met West, where rival clans, nationalities, religions, and empires collided. Bosnia's capital city of Sarajevo, an ancient settlement with roots in the distant past, consisted of a cluster of buildings stretched along both sides of the Miljacka River. It was laced together into a town by bridges. A torrent during the winter, the Miljacka slowed during the summer so that in June the riverbed was beginning to dry up. A British visitor in the late 1930s claimed that the waters of the Miljacka ran red, but that may well have been an optical illusion produced by a reading of history. The road that the motorcade followed into town was the Apel embankment, which ran parallel to the river. It was bordered on the Miljacka side by a low embankment and on the other side by houses. It was the town's only considerable thoroughfare. Centuries of rule by the Muslim Ottoman Empire had left their mark on the inhabitants, their dress, habits, and behavior. The appearance of the streets, especially as one turned away from the river into the narrow, winding streets of the interior, was distinctly oriental. The skyline of Sarajevo, punctuated by minarets, aglow in the dazzling summer sunshine, served as a reminder that the city often had changed hands. There were 100 mosques in Sarajevo, and almost as many churches. The synagogues, though less conspicuous, attested to a Jewish presence. A polyglot, multinational, religiously diverse population had learned to live, not only with one another, but also under whatever flag flew. Dominations and powers were temporary at best, and, as it happened, were about to change once again, as a result of the events in Sarajevo that June 28. That morning, Princip had stationed his fellow conspirators along the Apel embankment at 3 places where it was intersected by bridges. The motorcade driving along the quay therefore would be running a gauntlet. Princip's older friend Danilo Ilic was to serve as coordinator with no fixed place of his own, to move his gunmen when and where needed. Ilic, it will be remembered, had tried with no success to persuade Princip to follow orders to abort the mission. At the first of the bridges, the Archduke's procession entered a danger zone. 3 conspirators formed a line along the riverside of the quay, and 2 on the land side. The first attempt on the Archduke's life came from the riverside, from Nedeljko Kabrinovic, who asked a policeman to point out which was Franz Ferdinand's car. Then he knocked the cap off his bomb on a lamppost, to detonate it. He threw the bomb wildly at the Archduke's car, hitting the folded back hood of the convertible, from which it rolled off to explode against a wheel of the car following it. The Countess felt a graze on her neck from the detonator, flying wide, while an occupant of the car behind, Colonel Erich von Meritzi, an aide to General Potiorak, was wounded on the wrist by flying shrapnel. The noise of the explosion was alarming. Another officer and a number of bystanders were likely injured, and the procession stopped to inquire. Kabrinovic, the perpetrator, ran from the scene. He jumped from the embankment and tried to escape in the waters of the shallow riverbed. Captured by police who pursued him, he swallowed his poison pill, which turned out to be too old to work. Its only effect was to make him throw up. Princip, who had heard the explosion and shouts from a crowd, hurried to the spot, where it looked as though all was over. The gendarmes had Kabrinovic firmly in custody, and were bustling him off to the police station. None of the other conspirators was to be found. What happened to the others is most concisely recounted by A.J.P. Taylor. Of the other conspirators, one was so jammed in the crowd that he could not pull the bomb out of his pocket. A second saw a policeman standing near him and decided that any movement was too risky. A third felt sorry for the Archduke's wife and did nothing. A fourth lost his nerve and slipped off home. Alone, Princip wandered back to what had been his appointed station on the riverside of the Appel embankment at what was called the Latin Bridge. He then crossed the street. Accounts differ as to where he then stood or sat down. Franz Ferdinand decided to cancel existing plans, which called for his motorcade to maneuver through winding alleys on the way to the museum, but neither did he return the way he had come. After a stop at the town hall for a reception and speeches, he insisted on driving to the hospital to visit Colonel Meritzi, likely wounded in the Kabrinovic attack. The driver of the lead car either was not told or did not understand this. He followed original plans and turned off the Appel embankment into a side street to drive toward the museum, and the Archduke's driver simply followed. "Turn back!" General Potiorak shouted. The driver stopped. He considered how best to back out. His car's rear may have been blocked by the rest of the motorcade. He would have had to maneuver slowly in the narrow side street, perhaps putting his vehicle into reverse or trying a U-turn. Meanwhile the vehicle stood motionless. All this happened about 5 feet from Princip. He was surrounded by onlookers. He must have been astonished, but he thought quickly and seized his chance. He reached for a bomb in his pocket, and became aware that he was too hemmed in by the crowd to swing his arm for a free toss at his target. So he pulled out his pistol and fired 2 shots at point-blank range, hitting the Archduke's jugular with one and the abdomen of the Duchess with the other. At that distance it was almost impossible to miss. Princip then turned the revolver on himself, but was prevented from firing it by a bystander who hurled himself on the assassin's arm. It was not clear what had happened. To some the 2 shots that had run out unexpectedly sounded like the backfires to which automobiles were prone in those early days. Confusion erupted as the crowd and nearby police battled one another to get at the boyish assassin. Princip swallowed his suicide capsule, then vomited when it did not work. The mob began to beat him, and may well have been dragging him off to lynch him. Struggling, Princip used the handle of his weapon to hit back. Eventually the police wrestled him away from the crowd. Thereupon he dropped his bomb. Onlookers shouted out warnings as police reinforcements arrived and cleared the scene. Meanwhile the limousine with the dying royal couple fled to seek help. "Sophie dear. Sophie dear. Don't die. Stay alive for our children." Franz Ferdinand called out, and then, more weakly, but repeatedly, "It is nothing," as aides anxiously asked how he felt. The fatally wounded couple were rushed to the governor's residence, only minutes away. They had been shot at about 10:30 am, Sophie died at roughly 10:45 am, Franz Ferdinand, at around 11 am. It was not nothing.